The cruelest kindness a person can offer is rescue, because once you have saved something, you are bound to it, and it to you, in ways that neither of you chose, and neither of you can undo. The cold came first. It came through the gap beneath the still-room door, through the thin wool of Liana's apron, through the cotton beneath that, straight to the skin. She had learned not to shiver. Shivering cost warmth, and warmth was a resource she could not afford to squander. Not in January, not in the second year of her employment at Ashford Park, not with 16 shillings standing between her and absolute ruin. She pressed her back against the stone shelf and returned her attention to the tallow candle and the open ledger before her, and she did not think about the cold at all. It was the sound that made her look up, not a cry exactly. Something smaller than a cry, wetter, more desperate, a thin, fluting wheeze coming from the basket near the door where the estate's hound had whelped 3 nights ago. The other pups were fat and squirming, pink-nosed and insistent. This one lay at the edge of the litter, half covered by its siblings, its chest working in a shallow, frantic rhythm that Liana recognized without knowing its name. She recognized it because she had breathed like that herself, the winter her father died, and left her with nothing but a name that was worth less. Each month she could not afford to maintain it. She did not think. She crossed the still room, lifted the pup free, and tucked it inside her apron, against the warmth of her stomach. It weighed almost nothing, less than a candlestick. She stood there a moment, with her hand pressed to the bulge of it, feeling the shallow kick of its breathing against her palm, and she thought, well, this is a complication. She went back to the ledger. The pup survived the night. It survived the next night too, fed by Liana's careful spooning of warm broth from a twist of linen, tucked into a wool-lined box near the kitchen hearth when she could manage it, returned to her apron when she could not. Mrs. Greer, the housekeeper, saw the box on the second morning and said nothing. Mrs. Greer was not a sentimental woman, but she was an observant one, and she had observed that Liana's ledger work was flawless. Her inventory assessments were never wrong, and she asked for very little. These qualities earned a person a great deal of latitude at Ashford Park, where the mistress of the house, Lady Portia Ashford, operated on the principle that any resource not yet squeezed for profit was a resource being wasted. Lady Portia, Liana did not hate her. Hatred required energy she allocated elsewhere. But she understood Lady Portia the way she understood a difficult column of numbers, precisely, without sentiment, clear-eyed about the sum it would eventually produce. Lady Portia had engaged Liana 18 months ago as a lady's companion, a polite fiction both of them had tacitly abandoned within a fortnight. What Liana did, in fact, was manage the household accounts, negotiate with suppliers, draft correspondence, and absorb, with a face as still as water in a deep well, every small humiliation Lady Portia saw fit to dispense. The reduced wages, the room with no fireplace, the instruction, delivered in Lady Portia's ornate, particular way, that Liana was not to eat at the same table as visiting guests because it created a certain confusion about her station. "You are not quite a servant, my dear," Lady Portia had said, 6 months in, with the kind of smile that functioned as a weapon. "And you are not quite a lady. You are something wonderfully useful in between. I do hope you understand." Liana had understood perfectly. She was a woman of good birth and no fortune, which in the year 1818 made her slightly less consequential than a well-kept ledger. She was 24 years old. She had been beautiful once, people said, though they said it in the past tense even now, as though beauty were a property of girlhood, and she had already outrun it. She had pale, clear skin, a particular steady gray in her eyes, and brown hair she kept pinned with the efficiency of a woman who had stopped thinking of hair as ornament. She was, above all else, precise. She kept her hands from trembling. She kept her voice from rising. She did not weep in front of people who would enjoy it. The pup thrived. By the end of 3 weeks, it was rounded and clumsy and committed, with the blithe confidence of an animal that has never doubted its welcome, to following Liana through every room she entered. She called it nothing, because to name it was to want it, and wanting things in her current circumstances was a habit she could not afford. The kitchen staff called it Shadow. The name stuck. Shadow was 4 weeks old, and Liana was deep in the quarterly household accounts, which she was not supposed to be auditing, only copying, but which she had been auditing quietly for 6 weeks, because something in the numbers did not add up. when the front door of Ashford Park opened, and everything changed. She heard it from the accounts room. The particular quality of the silence that followed, that collective held breath, told her before any footstep or voice did. She had lived in enough grand houses to know the difference between an ordinary arrival and one that rearranged a room simply by occurring. She did not go to look. She had 17 line items to reconcile and a discrepancy of £412 that she needed to understand. She stayed at her desk. Shadow curled under her chair and snored softly. It was young Thomas, one of the footmen, who came to find her 20 minutes later, flushed and wide-eyed, to tell her that the Duke of Ravenswood had arrived. "He wasn't expected," Thomas said. "Her ladyship is in a state." "Her ladyship is frequently in a state," Liana said, and did not look up from the ledger. "He's asking to see the household accounts." She looked up then. The Duke of Ravenswood, Lucian Ashford, fifth of that title, and Lady Portia's husband's second cousin twice removed, though the connection was remote enough that Liana had never expected to encounter him, was standing in the great hall when she descended, and the first thing she noticed was not his height, though he was tall, nor the width of his shoulders in the dark coat, though both were considerable. The first thing she noticed was the stillness. He was not performing patience. He simply did not move in the way that men who were uncertain of themselves moved. He stood at the center of the hall with the particular, unhurried authority of a man who had never once entered a room and wondered whether he belonged in it. He was perhaps 35, fair-skinned, with dark hair going at the temples towards silver that he had clearly not noticed or not bothered to address. His eyes, when they moved to her, were a cool, direct blue that reminded her of winter light through old glass. He was not handsome in any simple sense. His jaw was too blunt for that, his brow too heavy. He was, rather, formidable in the way that certain landscapes were formidable. Cliffs, fells, the wide gray spread of the northern sea. You did not find them beautiful so much as you found yourself adjusting to their scale. He said, "You are the woman who manages the accounts." It was not a question. "I copy the accounts," Liana said, "for Lady Portia." Something moved very slightly at the corner of his mouth. "Bring them." Lady Portia appeared from the drawing room in a silk dress that must have been selected in 4 minutes and still looked immaculate, her fair face composed into its most gracious arrangement. "Your Grace, what an unexpected, we were not informed. Had we known you were coming, naturally we would have—" "The accounts," he said, without looking at her. Lady Portia's composure fractured, just at the edges. "The accounts are private household matters, Your Grace. I'm not certain it's—" "The Ashford Park estate," he said, in the same unhurried, blunt tone that was somehow worse than volume, "is held in trust under my authority until my cousin's heir reaches majority. The accounts are mine to review at any time and for any reason. Mrs." He looked at Liana. "Miss," she said, "Liana Voss." "Miss Voss, the accounts." She brought them. He sat at the accounts room table for 2 hours. She sat across from him, because he had indicated, with one brief hand gesture, that she should remain. Shadow emerged from beneath her chair after 20 minutes, examined the Duke with the frank assessment of a small animal with no concept of rank, and then placed its chin on the Duke's boot. Lucian looked down. He looked back at the ledger. He did not remove his boot. It was another 20 minutes before he spoke again. "This figure." He turned the book and pointed. "This is not the original entry." "No," Liana said. "You noted it. In pencil." "Yes." He studied her for a moment with those winter glass eyes. "How many such figures?" 31, over the past 14 months. I have a separate sheet." She produced it from the locked drawer she had taken care not to make obvious and slid it across the table. He read it. He did not rush. When he was finished, he set it flat on the table and rested his hand on it, and she had the sense that he was doing something internal, something that required the stillness, before he spoke. £412. 416, if you include the coal inventory in October. I could not be entirely certain of that one. He looked at her again. He did not look at the ledger. He did not look at the door. He was looking at her, with an attention so undivided that it was faintly alarming, not because it was unkind, but because she was not accustomed to being seen that clearly. "How long have you known?" "I began suspecting in November. I was certain by January." "And you said nothing?" "I had no authority to say anything. I was told I was copying accounts." The corner of his mouth did that thing again. It was not quite a smile. It was the outline of one, a controlled suppression of something that might otherwise be warmth. "Miss Voss," he said, "I would like you to be present when I speak to Lady Portia." Lady Portia, confronted in the drawing room with the Duke, the ledger, Liana's careful penciled notations, and the separate document listing 31 instances of altered figures, chose first to deny, then to minimize, and finally, when Lucian placed the separate document on the table between them, and said very quietly, "This is fraud, Portia, against the estate, against my cousin's heirs, and against the Crown's taxation records," to weep. Lady Portia wept beautifully. She had been doing it since girlhood, and she knew exactly how to deploy it. She spoke of loneliness, of insufficient allowance, of the impossible expense of maintaining Ashford Park on what she was given, and she looked at Liana once, a single, cutting look that said, "You wretched, disloyal creature," and Liana looked back at her steadily and said nothing at all. "The sum will be repaid," Lucian said. "Every penny. You will not manage this household's accounts going forward. You will not engage or discharge staff without my written approval. If I find a second set of alterations, I will refer the matter to my solicitors without further discussion." He paused. "Do you understand?" Lady Portia understood. He turned to Liana. "Walk with me." They walked the length of the East Gallery, while Shadow trotted between them, its claws clicking on the parquet in a cheerful, irregular rhythm, entirely mismatched to the gravity of the conversation. Lucian said, "What is your annual wage?" £22. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what should it be? She had not expected the question. She had prepared, in the way that she always prepared. She was always preparing for something, for him to thank her, or to dismiss her, or to offer something patronizing about how her diligence would not go unrewarded. She had not prepared for directness. It startled her into honesty. 45, for what I actually do. Possibly 50. He nodded, as though this were a number he had already arrived at by a different route. "I am removing you from Lady Portia's service. Effective today." The cold came back, through the tall gallery windows, through the walls, the same cold as always, and she kept her face from showing it. "I see. I require a competent person to audit the estate books at Ravenswood, all of them. My steward is honest but innumerate. The arrangement has cost me more than I care to calculate." He paused again. The pauses were not hesitations. They were considered. "The post is well appointed. You would have your own rooms. The wage would be £60, and reviewed at 6 months. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. Shadow ran ahead 3 paces, realized the humans had ceased to move, and trotted back to look at them with an expression of mild reproach. "You are offering me a position," Liana said carefully. "Yes. At your estate." Yes. She needed to think. She made herself think clearly, which meant she needed to not look at him for a moment, because looking at him made clear thinking more difficult, and she resented that, mildly, as a practical inconvenience. She looked at the gallery wall instead, at the line of painted ancestors in their heavy gilt frames, and she thought, £60, her own rooms, work she already knew how to do and had been doing for 14 months without proper title or compensation. And Shadow, who was currently attempting to eat the fringe of the hall runner. She said, "I would want it formally contracted, the wage, the scope of the role, and the terms of notice on both sides." Another of those fractional almost smiles. "Of course." And Shadow comes. He looked at the pup, who had abandoned the hall runner and was now sitting on his boot again, looking up at him with the calm certainty of an animal that had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the human to catch up. "Obviously," he said. She looked at him then. He was looking at the pup. His face, in profile, had something in it that his face in direct address did not, some unguarded quality, a loosening at the jaw, a slight softening at the eye, that she filed away the way she filed away anomalies in a ledger, precisely, without interpretation, to be returned to later. She said, "Then yes." They left Ashford Park 2 days later. She left with the same trunk she had arrived with, a locked document case containing the original annotated ledger copies she had made for her own records, and Shadow in a canvas-sided traveling crate that the pup tolerated with philosophical acceptance for approximately 7 minutes before Liana relented and let it sit on her lap for the remainder of the journey. Ravenswood in February was bleak and magnificent. The house stood on a rise above a valley that was all gray-blue distance and bare larch. The stone of the house itself, a dark, weathered ochre that looked like something the landscape had pushed up from underground rather than something men had built. It was 3 times the size of Ashford Park. The park alone was bigger than the whole of the Ashford estate. Liana sat in the carriage window as they rolled up the drive and felt something she had not felt in a long time, a sensation she had to identify carefully before she trusted it. She felt that she was equal to this. Not that it did not intimidate her. It did, but she was equal to it. The household received her with the precise, calibrated neutrality that very well-trained servants deployed toward a new arrival whose status was ambiguous. She was neither lady nor servant, in any simple sense, and Ravenswood's staff were too experienced to stumble over the ambiguity. Mrs. Alcott, the housekeeper, a compact, gray-haired woman with the bearing of someone who had managed large things for a long time, showed her to her rooms without comment and told her that dinner was at 7 and that the estate office was in the east wing. Her rooms were warm. There was a fire. There was a window that looked south over the valley, and in the morning light, she stood at it for 10 minutes before she could convince herself she was not going to cry. Not from sadness, but from something more complicated and less comfortable, a realization that she had been very cold for a very long time and had made a virtue of not noticing it. She did not cry. She opened her document case and went to work. The estate books were, as Lucian had said, the product of an honest but innumerate steward. There was no fraud. There was significant inefficiency, several contractual arrangements that were manifestly disadvantageous to the estate, and one arrangement with a coal supplier in York that had been overcharging Ravenswood by approximately £60 annually for at least 4 years. Liana found all of it within 10 days. She documented it carefully and left the summary on the estate office desk for Lucian to find. He came to the office the next morning. "The York coal supplier," he said. "Yes. Cartwright has used that supplier for 12 years. He has been overcharged by that supplier for 4 of them. Possibly more, but I can only verify back 4 years with the records I have." She had her pencil in her hand. She was aware, in a way that was new and faintly inconvenient, of exactly how close he was standing to the desk. "I can draft a letter of termination if you prefer, or renegotiation if you prefer the existing relationship. The renegotiated rate would need to be no more than 17 shillings per ton to be competitive." He said, "Termination." He paused. "How long did it take you to find this?" "The coal supplier?" 2 days. The rest of it took 8. He stood there for a moment. He had his hands clasped behind his back. He was looking at the document she had prepared with that same undivided attention he had given the Ashford ledger, and she had the same sensation of being looked at, not at the document, at her, past the document, that she had had in the accounts room at Ashford. "You could have taken 2 months, he said. "Most people would have taken 2 months." "I could have," she agreed, "but that would have been dishonest." He looked at her directly then. Most people also would not have called it that. She said nothing. She was very good at saying nothing. She had been practicing for years. What happened next happened gradually, then obviously. The days accumulated into weeks, and the weeks into something that had a texture of its own. She worked in the estate office from early morning until early afternoon, and sometimes in the evenings when there was something she wanted to finish. Shadow roamed the estate with the freedom of an animal that had decided everything in its orbit was its own personal sovereign territory, and the household received this as they received most things that arrived under the Duke's authority, with equanimity. He had begun taking Shadow on his morning rides, which had started when the pup had twice escaped the house and turned up at the stables, sitting beside the Duke's horse with the patient expectation of an animal that understood logistics. She watched it happen, not the ride specifically, but the slow thaw. A man who spoke in commands and monosyllables, who moved through his own house with the complete efficiency of someone who required no comfort because he had long ago stopped expecting any. She understood this because she had done the same thing. She recognized the architecture of it, the way you stopped wanting before you could be refused, the way you made yourself very small in your own interior so that there was nothing to be hurt. He was 36 years old, she learned from Mrs. Alcott, in one of the housekeeper's occasional, careful installments of information that were neither gossip nor exactly information, but something in between. He had been engaged once, 10 years ago, to a young woman who had died of a fever in the summer before their wedding. He had not been engaged since. He had run Ravenswood and 3 other estates, and a timber interest in Scotland, with complete competence and no discernible personal life, and the county said he was cold, which Liana recognized as the thing people said about someone who had made the same architecture she had made and was better at hiding it. She was at 43 days, and she was reviewing the timber accounts, when he appeared in the office doorway in his riding coat, with Shadow at his side, and said, "Come and see the north boundary." It was not a question. It also was not a command, quite. It was something in between, and she was fairly sure he knew it. She put down her pencil. She went and got her wool cloak. The north boundary ran along a ridge of birch and ash above the valley, and in the late February light, the bare branches made a white-gray lacework against a sky that was the same particular washed blue as his eyes, which she noticed, and then reprimanded herself for noticing. They rode for an hour without very much speech. Shadow ran the ridge in wide, delighted arcs, pausing periodically to look back at them with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "My father walked this boundary every spring," Lucian said. He was looking at the ridge, not at her. He said you could tell the health of an estate by its boundaries, by whether people had been maintaining them or letting them go. And these? They're sound. He paused. They are, largely, because the steward before Cartwright cared about them, not because I was paying sufficient attention. She looked at him. He was still looking at the ridge. She had noticed that he said true things flatly, without any apparent expectation that the admission of error required performance or apology. It was, she thought, a very particular kind of honesty that she respected, without knowing yet whether she trusted it. "You're paying attention now," she said. He looked at her then. The winter light was full on his face, and she saw the thing she had filed away from the gallery at Ashford, the unguarded quality, except it was fuller now, less suppressed. He said, "Yes." She was not going to mistake what that meant. She was 32 years old, which was old enough to be careful with herself. But she knew what it meant. 63 days in, the letter arrived. It came from Lady Portia's solicitors, and it was addressed to Lucian. She knew it was from them because she managed the estate correspondence and saw the frank before forwarding it. She did not read it. She forwarded it. But she was in the estate office when he read it, and she read his face instead, which was, for once, not still. He came to the office 15 minutes later. He placed the letter on the desk in front of her. "She is claiming," he said, "that the ledger annotations are fabrications, that you altered the accounts yourself and attributed the alterations to her." Liana read the letter. Her hands were entirely steady. She set it back down. "I see. My solicitors will need your original documents, the penciled copies you made." "I have them. I kept copies of the copies." She opened the document case. She extracted the locked secondary file, which she had maintained precisely because she had known, from the moment she made the first pencil notation, that documentation was the only protection she had. "I also have a letter from the coal merchant at Ashford, dated November, in which he confirms the adjusted invoice he received. I suspected that Lady Portia was diverting the difference." She laid everything flat on the desk with the neat, systematic precision of a woman who had been preparing for this possibility since November, and was not going to let it cost her anything now. He stood across the desk and looked at the documents, and then at her, and this time the unguarded thing was completely uncontrolled, which meant that whatever he was feeling was too large to manage in his usual way. He said, "You knew this was a risk." "Yes. From the beginning." "Yes. And you documented against it." "Of course." She paused. "I am not naive, Your Grace." He said, very quietly, "Lucian." She kept her face from doing anything. This required significant effort. That would be irregular. "Yes," he said. And he was not agreeing that it would be irregular. He was agreeing with the entire underlying subterranean conversation that they had been conducting for 63 days, which she had been pretending they were not having. Miss Voss, Liana, I am going to tell you something, and I would ask you to hear it carefully. I generally hear things carefully. I know you do. He did not come closer. He stood exactly where he was, with the desk between them, and the afternoon light coming through the south window, and Shadow asleep in the doorway, and the estate books around them. I am not an easy person. I am aware of that. I have been managing things for a very long time, and I have managed them well, and I have done it alone, and I had concluded, not tragically, simply practically, that this was how it was going to be. He paused. I had concluded incorrectly. She was going to say something careful and precise and measured, because that was what she did, and then she thought, no. She was 32 years old, and she had been careful for long enough. I am not easy either, she said. I have my own ideas about how things should be done, and I will not stop having them. I am not grateful in the way that would require me to defer to you. I am competent, and I intend to keep being competent, and I am not interested in being rescued. I know, he said. I am not interested in rescuing you. Then what are you interested in? He said. Partnership. The word landed in the room and stayed there. She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the north boundary in the February light, and Shadow running the ridge, and her father, and the winter she had breathed like that small pup at the edge of the litter, and the particular texture of a room with a fire in it, when you have been cold long enough that warmth has become something you no longer expect. She thought about the ledger, which was her language, the one she had been speaking in the dark for 3 years, and the fact that he had not just heard it, but had known, immediately, what she was saying. My solicitors, Lucian said, carefully, as though he were very aware that he was standing on something fragile and did not want to break it, will manage Lady Portia's claim without any difficulty. Your documentation is comprehensive. There is no scenario in which it does not hold. I know that, she said. And the post. Your role here is not contingent on anything except your own decision about whether you wish to stay. I know that too. He waited. She looked at the south window, at the gray-blue distance of the valley, at the bare lacework of the birch and ash on the ridge. She thought of her father, who had loved this kind of country, who had told her once that the thing about difficult landscapes was that they were never indifferent. They demanded something, yes, but they gave back what you brought to them, and then some. She looked back at him. I will need the formal partnership terms in writing, she said. The scope, the wage, the conditions, everything. Something crossed his face, relief, she thought, and something warmer than relief, something she did not have a ledger category for. Everything, he agreed, whatever terms you want. I want equitable terms. I want work that matters, and acknowledgement that it matters. I want, she stopped. She had been going to say something practical. What she actually wanted was larger and more complicated and harder to write into a contract, and she thought that he probably knew that, and she thought that this was, perhaps, the beginning of a different kind of fluency between them. I want, she said again, more quietly, what you said, partnership. He came around the desk then, not quickly. He moved the way he always moved, with deliberation, without performance, and he stopped when he was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples and the winter light in his eyes, and he offered his hand, not as a gesture of help, not as assistance, but with his palm flat and open, an equals gesture, a transaction between two people who were each bringing something to the table, and both knew it. She took his hand. Shadow woke up in the doorway, assessed the situation with the calm authority of an animal that had always understood exactly what was happening here, and walked over to sit on both their feet with serene, uncomplicated satisfaction. Outside, the valley light was shifting from winter white to the first tentative blue-gray of late February thaw, the kind of light that did not promise spring, but did not deny it either. The birch trees on the ridge held their bare branches against the sky in that patient way they had, storing what they needed, waiting. Lady Portia's legal claim was dismissed inside a month. Lucian's solicitors filed a counter-petition, citing the documented fraud, and the sum was repaid in full from the settlement of her late husband's personal accounts. She left Ashford Park for a smaller house in Derbyshire, and if she was bitter, which she was, comprehensively and at length, she was bitter elsewhere, which was the best that anyone could arrange. The contract was drawn up. £60 the first year, reviewed at 6 months as promised, and at 6 months it was reviewed and raised to 75, which Liana had said was equitable, and Lucian had agreed was equitable, and Mrs. Alcott had said nothing about, but approved of silently and completely. The estate books for that year were the most accurate and efficient Ravenswood had produced in 30 years, which Mr. Cartwright discovered when he began reviewing them for context, and had to sit down for a moment. The partnership, which was the word they both continued to use for several months, with a precision that everyone in the household recognized as the careful, deliberate habit of two people building something that would hold, became a betrothal in May, announced by Lucian to his assembled household staff in the same unhurried, blunt tone he used for all significant statements of fact. It became a marriage in July, in the small church in the village below the ridge, with Mrs. Alcott and Mr. Cartwright as witnesses, and Shadow in attendance outside the vestry door, which the verger had thoughts about but wisely chose not to voice. Liana wore pale gray silk, which was not traditional, and carried no flowers, which was also not traditional, and signed the register in the same steady, precise hand she used for the estate books, because she was the same person in every room she entered, and she had stopped apologizing for that a long time ago. Lucian signed beside her. His hand was large and warm against hers when he took it after, and she felt, in the stone-cold quiet of the vestry with the summer light coming through the narrow window, the same sensation she had felt standing at her Ravenswood window in February, that she had been cold for a very long time, and that warmth was not rescue. Warmth was something you built with someone who brought their own heat to it, who matched your need with equal need, who did not offer you charity, but stood beside you and said, "This, together, equal." She had saved a small, failing thing that a February night. She had kept it alive through sheer stubborn precision, through attention and warmth, and the refusal to accept that it was not worth the effort. And it had grown, unruly, devoted, absurd in its joy, into something that walked beside a duke like his own shadow, and into the rooms of a household that had been cold and efficient and lonely until both of them arrived, and into this moment in the vestry, where Liana held her husband's hand and was not grateful in any diminished or deferential sense, but was glad, which was a different thing, a better thing, the thing you felt when you had not been saved by someone else but had simply, stubbornly, saved yourself, and in doing so, found someone who had been waiting, without knowing how to say it, to be saved the same way. You know, perhaps, what it is to have kept yourself very small for a very long time, to have made precision and competence and composure into a kind of armor and worn it so long that you forgot there was something underneath it worth protecting. If you do, then you know that the moment it becomes safe to take the armor off is not a moment of weakness. It is the hardest, most deliberate act of courage a person can perform. Liana performed it in a vestry in July, with a ledger-clerk's hand, and a steady gray gaze, and a small, ridiculous, beloved dog at her feet, and it was, in the end, the most important thing she ever recorded.